there comes a time in every teacher's life when you must transition out of the Gilded Age and the Progressive era into the 1920s. Now, this is a big moment for me, and we're going to break this lesson, which is quite a big one, into two parts. This is the first part, the first two reasons for the prosperity the American people enjoyed in the 1920s. As we'll find out in later lessons, this prosperity was a little bit illusory, a little bit of a magic show. But in reality, the 1920s deserved its name, the Roaring Twenties, because of just how expansive the American economy became and the power of the consumer within. Now, as I said, the term the Roaring Twenties has come to denote what happened in those years. The popular narrative about the U.S. is that they'd experienced a period of unparalleled, almost incredible economic prosperity, which ends very suddenly. And we're probably all familiar with the stock market crash of 1929. And they basically say everything was great, and then the stock market crash happened, and people jump off buildings, as evidenced by the flattened pancake of a man on the right-hand side. This picture is too simple. Okay, what there is, no doubt, is a stock boom. The economy is going up. However, the fact that the boom is connected to the stock exchange collapse. These two things aren't necessarily connected. And as usual, and of course, because this is A level, it's a good bit more complex. And in the complexity lies the A. But we'll get to that over time. The extent of prosperity. Okay, so what do you have and why? Again, similar to World War II, maybe perhaps less magnified in terms of history, but equally as important, is the United States emerges from the First World War as the world's richest country. They do so because they spent, rather, the other rich countries in the world had basically bankrupted themselves buying guns from the United States and bombs. Effectively, they were the world's armament factory. And many believed, as a result of this, the United States, with its new prominence in the world, the fact that it had come in 1917 into 1918 and supported the Allies, would then step onto the world stage and set an example to the world with its evidence, with its emphasis on technological developments, economic efficiency, minimal government interference, and effectively that the United States would steer the world in the post-World War I era. Um, the reasons behind it are fivefold. Number one, small post-war recession. You see that the United States enjoys a remarkably small unemployment rate, never rising above 3.7 between 1922 and 1929. You have, as a consequence also of this a low unemployment rate and high employment rate, employees being allowed to work fewer hours. So things are doing well. People are actually working less than they had before the war. People are being paid more, a reflection on perhaps the wealth of American industry. Wages rising 14% between the start of World War I in 1914 and by the time of the crash in 29. There's huge economic growth, not even small, not even marginal or big. It's massive. Production rates rise 50%. It's a huge amount. Okay, we look at production rates being big today when we see production raising, somewhere around 4 or 5%. They're rising 50% between 1922 and 1929. The gross domestic product, the value of the things they produce, rises from 73 billion to 104 billion in the same period.
So that's the economic side of prosperity. But when we talk about prosperity, we need to talk equally as much about the impact on people's lives. If people are wealthier but don't get to spend that money on better goods or have a better quality of life, then arguably they're not as prosperous. So while there is an economic growth, there's simultaneous also a growth in lifestyle and improvement in lifestyle, which can also be described as prosperous. So we're also almost defining prosperousness as something beyond just mere money, but the quality of life or standard living as it goes on. And what we see for this whole period is Americans have far more time and disposable income to spend on leisure activities and stuff which generally gives that quality of life. In addition, that time is created by technological inventions, both ability to commute through cars, as we shall see, but also for women, for example, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and so, which then saves time and saves effort for people, which they then can use to indulge themselves or just anyway have a nice time or improve their quality of life. We see, for example, that 80 million cinema tickets are sold in 1929, evidence that both there is more time to go and spend on stuff that you want to do, but also people have more disposable income to spend it. Likewise, sport. Baseball and boxing really comes into its own in this period. The crowds at most baseball games, such as the
New York Yankees versus the Chicago Cubs.
Game. Oh, that game. Then they.
Important to note, actually, to give you an idea how much
Sorry,
leisure time they work.
Just talking.
No, I'm just going to put.
fine, go
You brought up baseball. It's important, and it's a really good example of just how boom times and how everyone is enjoying things. There's no lighting in baseball stadiums at this time, so every game was played at noon, which means that if you're going to have 45,000 people in your stands paying top dollar for a ticket, these people are all taking time off work.
Oh, that's quite fine. Okay, so what we need to make clear then is when we talk about prosperity, the factors which cause prosperity economically may not be the same that cause it socially, that quality of life. So we're now going to go through the several factors, so tariffs, tax reductions, foreign policy, etc., which lead to prosperity. And a good essay would say, well, this leads to prosperity in this way, this leads to prosperity in this way, and to which amount. Okay, some might give more money, but mean you have to work more. So is that better or worse? Some will give slightly less money, but mean there's far more time to enjoy that disposable income. So we're just going to head through the various different factors which led to that prosperity and describe how and why each improved life in the 1920s.
Now, this first one is government policies, and we've got to reflect back on something we learned at the Gilded Age. One of the keys to the Gilded Age was this notion that America's enjoying this laissez-faire. Governments can stay out of business. But in reality, the government is sort of hypocritical. They do, in effect, promote and create policies that are, let's say, the antithesis of laissez-faire. They don't get involved in the day-to-day running. This is not a nanny state by any stretch of the imagination, but the government is involved. Okay, the president at this time, who wins an election in 1922, coming to power in 1923, is Calvin Coolidge, Republican, and he says the chief business of the American people is business, and he forms his government to be as hands-off as possible. His Secretary of the Treasury, okay, Andrew Mellon, is probably one of the greatest believers in the free market. Mellon, you may have heard of him, okay? Andrew Mellon, Carnegie Mellon University, one of the best universities in the United States, located in Pittsburgh, is co-named after him and Andrew Carnegie. Now, that said, Andrew Mellon believes in the free market. He's one of the richest men in America, and he believed in the concept of trickle-down economics, the idea that if you allow the rich to thrive and prosper, they will invest the money that they make, and that money will trickle down to people at the lower rungs of the social classes, and therefore they will prosper as a consequence of the rich prospering as well. The idea that the rich spend, I guess the whole concept is based around the idea that they're not going to hoard it, and we know that perhaps not to be true, but nevertheless, trickle-down economics is probably one of the driving ideas of one of the driving ideas of economics in the 20th century, and it's still with us to a degree today. And to say that it's completely untrue is unfair of me. I will say that there are elements of, like all things, there are elements that are true, and there are elements that are not necessarily true.
A little bit good and a little bit bad.
That's right, Mr. Souter. Anyways, so government policy. There appears to be this appears to be the right idea. There are more jobs, more wages, more people consuming, buying things. There's more expansion in industry and so on. So the basic policy of laissez-faire, very similar to the Gilded Age, is that the government will not do anything but intervene to support business policy in four main ways, each of which we'll take individually. Number one, keep the tariffs high. So the tariff issue, which had become a big issue of the progressives, that is lowering it, will be returned to in regards to protectionist tariffs again in the 1920s. Tax reduction, fewer regulations, and foreign policies. Now I'm turning over to Mr. Souter to talk to you about the first, which is high tariffs.
You thought they were gone. It's tariffs again.
So the Underwood tariff is over.
Hey, this is my turn. The tariffs.
Just passionate.
So we have the end of the Democrats, we have the rise of the Republicans, and with the rise of the governments, we see tariffs. Now, the Fording-McCumber Act basically undoes all the good work of the Underwood tariff, which in reality didn't massively make a huge difference. But we see a rise, therefore, in costs for imported goods. The cost of those, and therefore the competitiveness of imported goods, is far lower than that of American goods. That means if you're an average American, the goods produced in America, which are not being added to a tariff, are cheaper and therefore more competitive. This is great, because if you are a domestic company, you are guaranteed of a rich, large market to sell your goods. You are more likely, therefore, to invest in machinery. You're more likely to hire more people. You're more likely to keep your business going, as it were. So you can argue, therefore, that this is great because it drives capitalism, which therefore drives wealth, and is great because it means that more Americans are employed, because if you buy goods from, say, France, then those French workers are getting employed to make the goods, not American workers. So you can say that this really contributes to prosperity, meaning that loads of Americans have jobs and they're super happy. This is true if you work in industry and you live in the city. You can argue that the standard tariff argument is that if, however, you are someone who doesn't get protected by tariff, i.e. a farmer, or someone who isn't in the industrial zone, as it were, the fact that you have to pay more for your goods because cheaper foreign goods are basically being kept out harms your prosperity and harms your quality of life. So already we're starting to get this real hint of prosperity in the 20s. Well, whose prosperity is it? And I think the tariffs are a real good example to say this helps some people's prosperity, the northerner, the working class industrial zone, and harms others, Midwestern, southerners, and primarily agricultural factors. So this is a little bit more complex than most other ones.
Now, as of course, on the back of that, because they're making more money off tariffs, the government sees fit to give the rich tax reductions. And what we see in 1924, 26, and 1928 is the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, handing out about $3.5 billion in tax reductions. And you may be thinking, well, that's good. That benefits everybody. What you need to remember about the 16th Amendment is that only the rich were paying tax. The majority of Americans still did not pay income tax because they didn't earn enough. So what we have is we have the rich effectively getting lower and lower taxes. Okay, the Coolidge government, mostly because of the boom in the American economy, actually still runs a budget surplus, but they get away with it. But what they do is they do turn off a way that in tough times they can get money from the people who have the most of it. So that's, I guess, the first regards in regard to tax reductions. Okay, so that's a big reason industry expands, and it is fair to say that some people, some of these large-scale industrialists, will reinvest that money that is not being taken to the government into improving business or expanding their business. Another one has to do with fewer regulations. The government under Coolidge purposely retracted a lot of the regulatory powers established by the progressive presidents. And from 1923 up until 1929, they don't let's just say, get rid of the regulations. They underfund and understaff. Now, for everything to be followed, to bust a trust, you need people who are capable of investigating the trust and then carrying through with busting the trust. Without getting rid of the powers so as not to anger people, they quietly and slyly, under the radar, remove the people who do work these jobs, underfund the agencies so they are less able to go out and do what they're intended to do. The FTC, for instance, the Federal Trade Commission, was unable and therefore unwilling to operate effectively. Business, therefore, could carry on completely unhindered. The FTC set up to regulate trade between the states and to prevent things like the growth of holding companies and trusts cannot do its job. And therefore, these sort of mega corporations, which squeeze the little guy out of business and really enhance the profits of the wealthy, are free to continue on in the 1920s. Laws concerning price fixing, especially in the railroads, were often ignored. When the government does, in the rare case, prosecute offenders, most will win on appeal anyway. So that the actual regulation itself, if it actually happened, was irrelevant. Now, of course, all of this is really good for corporate profit. Many people welcome less government, but as a result, there's absolutely no authority to regulate labor. So what you have in areas, particularly the South, child labor becoming commonly used again. The average worker does a 56-hour week. The average pay in the South goes only to 18 cents per hour, which is quite a bit below the, let's just say, the needed amount of money in order to sustainably feed and clothe yourself.
So moving on to foreign policy. Um, there's two ways foreign policy helps. The first way is on this slide, and that's the idea that by having a hands-off, basically let's not get involved attitude towards foreign policy, America gets a lot of goodwill. Essentially by emphasizing diplomacy, negotiating, and basically not getting involved in other countries' business. A lot of countries who may be quite annoyed at America for tariffing the hell out of their goods are more positively disposed, more willing to give America a chance, or are willing to not put tariffs in return to carry on that goodwill. The idea is America have let us get away with X, we better not tariff them or they might stop letting us get away with X. And so Mexico is a good example. They settled the rampant border disputes which had happened since the foundation of America, pretty much, well, not quite. And they, in return, got a significant degree of foreign trade, mostly actually American exports. And so you can argue that this positive foreign policy undoes the potential damage of tariffs, because the average argument of tariffs is if you have tariffs, your opposition will have retaliatory tariffs, i.e. tariffs in response. But this means that, oh, well, we won't give them tariffs because they did a good job, we like them, or slash, they're being right by us now, we don't want to tempt fate. The other way is by essentially not having a role in foreign policy, the government doesn't really look at bad empires such as Japan and say, don't trade with them. The government doesn't get involved in any foreign policy. So, for example, if you mentioned today, there are certain countries in the world, so North Korea, although this might get dated quite quickly, where the government says you can't trade with them. And that means there's limited markets. Well, there are a lot of bad countries knocking about in the 1920s. But the government, because it's very hands-off, because it's very laissez-faire, because it wants to encourage business, really allows American business to invest wherever it wants, with whomever it wants, and make a ton of money. And we can argue that basically these businessmen ignore protests, they ignore challenges, even from the State Department, the equivalent of the Foreign Office in America. And it basically allows them to make as much money as possible, bringing in money from other countries to America.
Now, that's the first one. So that's what government does to promote the boom of the 1920s. Now we're going to look at what people do at the sort of the lower levels. And we're going to start with looking at technological advances. And we're going to cover that as the last of the points. There are a few others, but we'll cover those in part 2. Now, technological advances. Okay, so industry, as we know, and as I've mentioned before, makes tremendous strides. Many of the great industrial firms that you may be familiar with are really established or have their peak period in the 1920s. You have huge increases in the quality and variety of products on sale as Americans seek to make wealth. They become incredibly creative. And you have really a proliferation of things that we consider normal that are invented and introduced at this time. One example could be the freezer or the icebox or the refrigerator, the toaster, these types of normal things, the electric iron. These are things that are created in the 1920s in the United States of America. The motor vehicle industry, though, perhaps greater than any other, electrical and consumer goods coming a close second, are the best examples of the technological advance. So let's walk you through a few things about the motor vehicle industry.
So clearly it was very successful. There's a bunch of facts from there you can read at your own leisure that basically a load of cars were made. Now this is good for two reasons. You can argue that having a huge industry that makes good generates money for the economy. It employs workers, the profits that Ford make are invested elsewhere, which then generates more money. Other countries buy the cars, and this really brings money into the economy. And that's the first argument. By making so many cars so efficiently, which Ford famously did through his assembly line, which is something we talked about previously, he has really brought down the price of cars, and therefore able to sell more, make more money, employ more workers. So, for example, Detroit really grows in this period to really make these cars.
Earning the nickname the Motor City.
Thank you. As well, but by the 1920s, there had been competition. Now, the interesting thing about this is not only by making it cheaper do you make more money and therefore have the economy. You are, going back to that thing we mentioned at the very start, also improving the quality of life of many Americans. If the cars are cheaper, more Americans can buy cars. And if more Americans can buy cars, they can have a better quality of life because they can commute quicker, they can live in nicer areas because it's slightly further out, they can go on holidays, they can go on trips, and it really improves prosperity in a social sense as well as an economic sense. But anyway, the motor vehicle industry really starts developing in the 1920s with Ford losing his market share. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, really start being in competition. And Ford really in the 1920s loses his share of the market through his inability to provide new, more exciting, more comfortable, more stylish cars. For example, in 1927, he's forced to basically close and redesign the machines in his factories to make a new, more comfortable car. And we can say, well, this isn't great for those 660,000 men who lost their jobs, but it is good because it's improving the quality of the experience and responding to consumer demand. And we can argue prosperity isn't just about making money, as mentioned. The fact that more Americans are having cars of better quality, of better comfort, of better style, more suited to what they want, improves their general quality of life.
Now, the car, beyond just being an economic driving force, has lots of social and also additional economic impacts beyond just, a lot of people get jobs building cars. Let's take a look at some of the positive impacts. You get 7% of Americans employed in the motor industry, and the wages they're paid are very good. They make 9% of all of the overall wages paid to American workers in the 1920s. Very importantly, and we'll talk about this shortly, they'll stimulate other industries that were never in existence before, such as the industry surrounding filling your car with petrol, the rubber industry used for tires, the parts industry, the radio industries for radios that have to be installed in cars. You think of all of the components that go into a car. There's always associated industries that support this overall machine. And the car industry is so fundamentally important and spawns so many other businesses that actually, in a sense, it could be quite negative. But I'll get to that in a sec. On a social aspect, it meant that people could go further afield to seek work. You lived in a city or in the periphery of the city, you could only go a few miles or wherever public transport took you. Now you have the car, you have the freedom, you can seek jobs elsewhere. It gives people a wider range of mobility. It diversifies the different options open to people, which is very positive overall for the economy. On the negative, Americans smash into each other with these new cars all the time. You have 20,000 people dying in road deaths by 1929, which becomes one of the leading causes of, let's just say, unforeseen death in the United States, replacing things like suicide, and that by a wide margin by 1929. The second thing is, the larger the industry, the more likely you are to get trade unionism, i.e. worker organizations. And trade unionism grows in the 1920s. Not that it will be a significant force, but it will become an incredibly powerful force as a consequence of what happens in the 1920s and the growth of industry in the decades to come. And really you have your genesis in your organization here. And they'll have some powerful wins in the 30s and much more so later on. But it really begins here. And also, as I said, because of the nature of the fact that these companies like Ford, for instance, has so many suppliers and so many hanging on industries, when Ford has to close in 1927, what it does is because it loses its market share and it realizes it has to diversify. We have to make multiple cars. We have to make newer cars. So they have to legitimately shut down all of their factories and retool their factories to produce new and different types of cars that people want. Their closure alone, okay, one company stimulates a recession nationwide. Okay, the job losses that drive this recession are not necessarily just at Ford. They are the ripple effect of Ford's closure, creating massive job losses in a lot of their suppliers. Another interesting factor, talking about ripple effect of the motor industry, is the building of roads. Now, this is, of course, another job creator, but it's also an example of the federal government having to break with their laissez-faire policies. The industry expands to such a degree that the government has to start building roads. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 gives responsibility to the federal government for building the roads on which cars will travel. Highways are built at a rate of 10,000 miles per year by 1929, which actually isn't nearly enough. Motor vehicles stimulate new service industries along these roads, garages, motels, petrol stations. Okay, and there are new opportunities for industry. goods can be moved more easily around. Okay, trains are great, but they are limited in where they go. Now you have the ability to get into niche areas, easier to move stuff from farms to factories or from factories to markets. And you have, of course, with that, the birth of a trucking industry or the lorry driving industry, which is so important for the transportation of goods today, has its genesis in the era of the car and the road. The last one we'll talk about, and the last slide for today, is the growth of electrical and consumer goods. Having talked about the car, it's important to note that electrical goods boom. I had mentioned a few things earlier. Now, mass production, as applied to things like cars, was also applied to the production of things people want. Okay, this leads to the large-scale development of labor-saving devices, vacuums, electric irons, refrigerators, etc. By 1929, there were 160 million electrical goods sold in America. Now, we're going to be a little bit careful here. Let's not over exaggerate and believe that everybody in America has a house full of consumer goods right now. Most of rural America doesn't even have electricity throughout the 1920s. Therefore, the development of things like the electric iron or the vacuum is completely irrelevant to the people living in rural areas. By 1928, even though the freezer had existed, only 20,000 of them were owned by Americans. It's not very many. Electrical goods companies will also overproduce massively. In fact, they build way more things than they need, and there's a huge glut in the market. Now, one of the key issues that leads to problems in 1929 is not necessarily the fact that there was an unregulated market. It's the fact that American industrialists expanded and expanded and expanded, and they overproduced. And this was a key to the problems in the economy by the late 1920s. And we'll talk more about a few of those issues in part two. But that's it for part one. The first two reasons why American expanded. We'll come back with the remaining three in another lesson.